Why, you clumsy girl! I ought to wallop you with a wet towel. That would serve you. Annabelle rubbed her head. Sorry, Mrs. Channing. The cook grabbed her by the arm and twisted. Now be useful and run off to the butcher and fetch me some bacon. Annabelle balked. I have to scrub the cage. No buts. I'll welt your bare backside. Be off with you, you spawn of a traitor. Annabelle dashed out of the kitchen back door. She flew through the garden gate, feet peppering the yellow and red leaf-strewn sidewalk as she rounded a bend toward the street and into a back alley. Though she ran fast, she didn't escape notice. Neighborhood children called her, Pidge of the Ridge, Pidge of the Ridge. She practically lived up there on the ridge of Mrs. Holmes' roof, and she was always covered in feather down. The name-calling had gone on so long, she answered to the slur. But just because she'd gotten used to it didn't mean she liked it. Still, there were worse nicknames than Pidge of the Ridge. There was being called a traitor's spawn. That was worse. Annabelle didn't believe the charges against her father. He was as honest and decent as any man. Well, except for all the secrets. But magicians always traded in mysteries, and her father would never tell his. Not even to save himself from prison. That was a kind of honesty all its own. Still, it did not look good. No one had ever found the man her father had claimed had framed him. Red Jake or Jacob Unwich or whatever his name was. And now Annabelle wasn't quite sure what she believed. Guilty or not, the conviction made his name bad, and her name bad too. She would be called a traitor or the spawn of a traitor for the rest of her life. It was lucky she had Mrs. Holmes and her roof to scrub of pigeon poop and never have a holiday. Everyone said so. The neighborhood kids who ran through the alleys, pointing and laughing, were right. She wasn't normal. Something was deeply wrong on her insides, and she had to work very hard to try to put it right. And maybe then, someday, the taint would fade. But it didn't seem likely. Cheeks flushed and lungs heaving, she opened the butcher shop door, the bell chiming as she stepped up to the counter. The smell of smoke made her cough into her sleeve. The block was a gruesome slab of wood, stained with blood and littered with cuts of pork and pig entrails. Annabelle tried not to look too long in any one direction, especially at the butcher, whose bald head was soggy with sweat, and his swollen red lips alternated between puffing thick clouds of gray smoke and sucking a thick brown cigar. What can I get you? The butcher swung a heavy cleaver down onto a pig's haunches with a thump. Annabelle flinched, but spoke up quickly. 2 pounds of bacon, sir. The butcher's cigar dropped an ash onto the ham. On the Holmes account? Annabelle stared at the ash-dusted ham. Yes, sir. An instant later, she took the wrapped package of bacon from the butcher, thrust it in her apron pocket, and dashed outside, the door's bell jingling like mad behind her. She had to hurry, had to get that deck clean before breakfast. Annabelle was halfway home when 2 hoodlums darted into the road and stood fast, arms folded, barring her way. They were about her age, 13 years old, and skinny as rails, but Annabelle knew they were tough. She had watched them fight in the street before, spying from the safety of Mrs. Holmes' roof. One hoodlum had blonde hair and a wild cowlick that made his front bangs stand up on end. The second was stocky with black hair and bruises on his meaty knuckles, either from hitting or from being hit, but probably both. Meaty Knuckles did the talking. It's Pidge of the Ridge, the trader's daughter. What's that you've got in your apron there, Pidge? Annabelle balled her fists. Showing weakness would be a mistake. Get out of my way. Let us have the package and we'll leave you alone, said the boy with the cowlick. Annabelle stood her ground. I said get out of my way. Meaty Knuckles lunged straight for her, and just as he did, something happened, something strange. It was as if the boy had stepped onto a puddle of glue, and he fell hard onto the brick pavement. Annabelle dodged around him and dashed down the alley, the two hoodlums chasing pell-mell behind her. She dodged around a corner, and a piece of paper litter flew into her face. She pulled it away and saw there was writing on it, beautiful writing that sparkled with glitter. The note read, "Toss." Annabelle let the note fly up behind her, and the instant she did, a cloud of feather down rained into the alley right over the boys' heads. Unbelievable. The boys had to stop and clear feathers from their eyelashes. They coughed and sputtered. Annabelle darted around another corner and took yet another flying paper in the face. This one smelled like cinnamon. It read, "Spit." There wasn't time for politeness. She spat fast on the paper and tossed it behind her as it erupted into a plume of dark brown smoke. The smell of spice wafted downwind and her eyes watered. The boys didn't follow this time. She left them standing in the street, rubbing their eyes and hacking their lungs out. Annabelle gazed up at the windows in the alleyway. Where had those messages turned booby traps come from? They were strange, but not strange. Parlor tricks of that kind barely raised a magician's daughter's eyebrows. Someone kind and a little bit clever had obviously made them and tossed them out of the high windows above the alleyway. Who was it? Did she have a friend? The thought gave her a little thrill. Annabelle dashed through the garden gate. But no, 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 no. The gardener's mongrel dog, Bruiser, sat on his haunches outside the kitchen door. Bruiser was part Rottweiler and who knew what else, though she half suspected hyena. He was twice her size, and at least 5 times as hungry, and his nose twitched in the air as she approached. "Bruiser, don't you dare." He leaped up and sank his teeth into her apron pocket, ripping it wide. Annabelle wrestled the package back from Bruiser's mouth, but his jaws only sank deeper into the bacon. Twigs and dry leaves pelted her face as he dragged her across the ground on her stomach, her grip clinging to the bacon for all she was worth. A scrap of paper flew into her eyes, but before she could read it, it fluttered onto Bruiser's wet, quivering nose. Instantly, the dog let go, turned tail, and scampered into the street, whimpering as he ran. She was saved again. But who was behind it? Annabelle sat up and dusted her knees and hands. Then she glanced down at the package, wrapped in butcher paper, and groaned. It was printed all over with Bruiser's massive jaw marks. Mrs. Channing would notice, and Annabelle couldn't fix it, unless maybe. On tippy-toes, she crept into the kitchen. Quickly, she found a skillet, unwrapped the package of bacon. Fingers trembling, she peeled the jaw-mangled strips of bacon away and lined them out on the frying pan. Then she lit the stove, and none too soon. Mrs. Channing bustled in from the pantry, calling out, "Get out of my kitchen." Pleased to oblige, Annabelle scampered out, only heaving a sigh when she finally reached the top of the stairs with her fresh bucket of vinegar water. When she stepped out onto the roof deck, however, her breath caught in her chest. Mrs. Holmes stood on the roof deck wearing a pink dressing gown and slippers, with a hasty addition of a silk scarf wrapped around her neck to guard against the brisk morning air. Her blonde wig sat perched up on top of her head less like natural hair than a bird's nest, and a pigeon seemed to agree because one of them swooped down and landed on top of her head. She didn't swat it away, and Annabelle was tempted to giggle, except that Mrs. Holmes' mouth had turned down into a frown. She hung her head and waited for a scolding. "Do you realize what time it is?" Yes, ma'am. I've just come from the butcher." "Don't make excuses. You know about the luncheon." The luncheon. Annabelle's face heated. There was to be a luncheon of the Ladies' Aviary Goodwill Society, and Mrs. Holmes was hosting. Do you have any concept of what it means to give loyal, honest service? I suppose you don't, given where you've come from. I often doubt you can even learn. You were to have the rooftop scrubbed and polished from top to bottom by this time. I'm sorry to be so late, Mrs. Holmes. You are indeed Annabelle Silvers. I'm ashamed that my pretty birds should be committed to such negligent care. Get scrubbing, and fast, or I'll have the gardener feed your breakfast to the mongrel dog. Mrs. Holmes padded past her and down the stairs, her fuzzy pink slippers leaving tufts of pink feather down behind her. In spite of everything, Annabelle giggled, then laughed until she doubled over, holding her stomach as her whole body shook. I know something about your breakfast, Mrs. Holmes. And the gardener's mongrel dog has already had it. Annabelle peered off into the horizon, where the finches chirped, gliding across the winter skyline. She wished she could fly away. But as for running away, she wasn't going to do that without a plan. Living on the streets like bruised knuckle boy wasn't tempting. In the meantime, there were pigeons to see to. First, she washed the roof with a horsehair brush that scratched across the cold stone pavers. Then she scrubbed around the outside of the cage until every paver gleamed. Finally, she opened the latch to the towering birdcage. Annabelle viewed doorways like her father taught her to, like agents of possibility. The opening of any door was a symbol of what might be. But a cage was also a symbol of what could not be. And Annabelle found as much meaning from the cage as she did from the opening. The cold iron bars of the birdcage closed around her like a vice. But this morning wasn't just any other day. It was the 888th day of her arrival at Mrs. Holmes' house. She had counted. 888 was a number of exquisite roundness, where harsh ridges and corners weakened, softened, and slipped into circular loops that gave way to exhilarating slides. With those slides came fresh momentum, and fresh momentum brought a little spark, and even the possibility of magic. Annabelle knelt down in the darkness, a pigeon perched on either shoulder, and plunged her scrub brush into the sour water, working by smell and also by feel, alive to the idea that something was different. Something had happened in the alleyway. Something strange, something exciting was laced in the printing upon the scraps of paper that had exploded in the sky above the hoodlum boys. The wind whispered, flitting the stray hairs of her braids, tickling her neck and sending a faint sensation down her spine all the way to her toes, as though she were sliding through the loops of a giant figure 8. Childerbridge's skies usually glowered gray and gloomy, shedding no hint of sunlight over the roof deck. But what was that? Not the sun, no, something else. A finger of light broke through the cloud barrier and poured down over Mrs. Holmes' roof garden. Something chimed like the ringing of a bell, and Annabelle turned her gaze upward at the glittering shower falling upon her head and all around her. When she finally glanced down again, she started. The roof was falling away from her. But it couldn't be. Roofs don't collapse without warning, and if they did, all their occupants would fall with them. It wasn't the roof falling. She was rising. She was floating. No, wrong again. She was flying. With only a thought and a gesture of her hand, she could steer, she could rise, she could dive, she could fly. Heart pounding in her chest and eyes shining, up she soared, out of the pigeon cage and over the rooftops. She forgot her empty stomach and her scrubbing brush. She forgave the pigeons as she swooped over the chimneys, carefree as a bird and almost as light-winged, turning somersaults, diving down over the park, fingers grazing the treetops. She swooped and sailed through the morning air, even as a warm yellow light began to peep out from the clouds. She squinted into the sun, but this was no sun. though it carried a similar sense of self-importance. It was a glowing yellow orb, but much too small and much too close, and rapidly getting closer. Soon it was hovering right in front of her, and she could see within a tiny person. A woman no taller than her hand was long, with delicate dragonfly wings and an imperious expression, strange to see on so small a face. The orb was a pixie. The pixie beckoned with one hand, then turned and darted away into the dark sky. Unfortunately, Annabelle had a weakness for flying, and pixies are expert at exploiting human weaknesses. This wasn't the well-planned, level-headed escape she'd wished for. Everyone in Childerbridge knew nothing good came of chasing a fairy. Annabelle knew it, but she followed, so help her.